so we're going to go through and watch this, and I'll take attendance while this is playing.
Hello, everyone. In this video, we're going to learn about the elements of art. So the elements of art are a lot
Can you
like
guys hear it okay? Jackson, can you hear it okay?
I guess.
Yeah.
Ingredients of a recipe.
Thanks.
It's basically all of the things that we need to put together in artwork. So for an actual definition, the elements of art are the building blocks of art. So another analogy we could think of is kind of like in chemistry, the chemical elements like oxygen and nitrogen and carbon, those are the building blocks of life. Those are the smallest pieces of our universe that are going to put everything together and create new things. So in art, the elements like line, color, value, shape, texture, those things are the smallest elements that we have in artwork, and we put those together to create an artwork. So let's talk about our first element of art, line. So a line is something we're very accustomed to. We write with it, we draw with it. But simply put, a line is a mark with length and direction. So what are some words that we can use to describe some different types of lines? Let's look at this image by Jean-Michel Basquiat and see what kinds of lines that we can find. You might see some straight lines. There's straight lines here. There's curvy lines. There's jagged lines. There's hatched lines. There we see multiple lines kind of in a row. There's scribbly lines. There's zigzag lines. We've got kind of curly-Q lines, and even some drippy lines. So we can use all kinds of adjectives to describe lines in artwork. Now, line variation. When we talk about line variation, we're talking about using a variety of thin and thick lines, or varying the weight of a single line to create interest. So when I talk about line weight, I'm talking about how thick or thin it is. So if we vary the weight of a single line, we might start very thin and then make it get thicker in the middle and then thin again at the other end. So we're going to look at an artwork by illustrator Kim Jung-gi. So when we look at his ink artwork here, how is he using line variation in this image? We can see examples of some thicker lines, along with lines that start thick at the edge and get thin towards the end. Here we see thicker lines that follow the outside edges and thinner lines on the inside. So he uses a wide variety of line variation to help create interest in this image. Now, contour lines are probably some of the first lines that we draw when we start to learn about art. So contour lines are lines that follow the outer edges of an object. They're kind of like an outline. So when we look at these drawings by Egon Schiele, he uses contour lines a lot in his artwork. So we can see how the lines are primarily just following the outer edges of the subjects that he is drawing, whether it's buildings or people. And what's interesting about his use of contour lines is sometimes he kind of stops drawing them. So we have sort of empty spaces, and our brain kind of fills in those gaps to figure out what's going on in between those spaces. Another type of contour is blind contour. So it doesn't mean that we close our eyes when we're drawing, but it does make us blind in kind of a different way. And blind contour would be drawing contour lines without looking at the paper. So when we do that, it forces us to really look at the subject that we are drawing. So we stare intently into the soul of whatever it is we're drawing. Maybe it's a person. It's going to make them really uncomfortable because your eyes never leave them when you're drawing them. And what's really fun about blind contour is they usually turn out looking pretty goofy.
If you don't already know, Grammarly is an online tool that can help you with any writing you do in your day-to-day life. The free version...
For some reason, those are so much louder than the actual lady. Sorry.
So as you can see here, things are not usually in the right place, but that's what makes them really fun to look at and fun to do. It's usually pretty amusing to look down and see your artwork after doing a blind contour drawing. So although these may look really messy, they are actually really important because they help us see like an artist. So we're following the edges of their eyes, and we're starting to get those sort of spatial skills that we need when we're drawing in order to draw things realistically. So it's kind of good practice to get into the habit of doing blind contour, maybe even just as a warm-up before you do any sort of regular drawing. But we're going to move on to the next element of art, and the next element is value. So when we talk about value, I don't mean things like, oh, that's expensive, or family values, right? This is a different type of value. So in art, value is the lightness or darkness of something. So is it black, gray, white? Those are values, how light or dark things are. So here we see an example of some value scales. So a scale of values would just be going from light to dark or dark to light. So value just tells us whether things are light or dark or somewhere in the middle. And that leads us into our next element of art, which is color. So how do we see color? This is kind of a science question. What we need in order to see color is a light source to shine its beautiful rays down, and it's going to hit an object, whatever that may be. And that spectrum, the light spectrum, if you remember, white light is a combination of all of the colors put together. So as that white light shines down onto an object, parts of that spectrum bounce back. So the parts that bounce back end up in our eyes, and then all those cones and rods do all their little sciencey stuff and interpret the color, and it sends all of those little brain waves to us, and it's like, oh, hey, that's a color. Let's simplify that a bit. I'm not a scientist, clearly, but color is basically seen by light reflecting off of an object. That's a lot easier. What are some words that we can use to describe different colors? First of all, hue would be the name of a color. Think things like red or blue or green or turquoise or mauve. The next word that we can use to describe colors would be intensity. So intensity is either the brightness or the dullness of a color. We can also call this saturation. So if a color is really intense and vivid and bright, then it would be very saturated. If it's very dull and dingy, it would be desaturated. So it would not have a lot of intensity to it. But when we look at artworks, we can use all kinds of different adjectives to describe colors. So here we have two very different artworks by Janet Skates and Hannah Woodman.
I just think it's cool that her last name is really close to my last name. So, Janet Skates.
So when we look at Janet Skates' art, what words could we use to describe these colors without naming the hues? We could say they're very bright, they're intense, they're vivid, they're saturated. Perhaps we could say they're playful or happy colors. If we look at Hannah Woodman's painting, we might consider her colors maybe muted or neutral or desaturated. Maybe they're darker. Some areas are bright. You could say some of the colors are dull. So there are lots of different adjectives that we can use to describe colors. Now let's talk about another element of art, and that is space. So when we talk about space, we're not talking about outer space. We are talking about the space inside of an artwork. So space in art would be the area around, above, or inside an object. Now there are two types of space. There's space that involves depth, so how far things go back or forward in space. And then there's also space that involves the shape of areas in an artwork. So the first kind we're going to talk about involves depth. So with shallow space, there's not much depth in the artwork. So if we think like a puddle is kind of shallow, meaning you don't go down very far in it, right? So there's not a lot of depth to it. In an artwork, when we have shallow space, objects are close together without much room to move around. So here are a couple artists with artworks that involve shallow space: Andy Goldsworthy and Utagawa Kunishida. So very different artists, for sure. But when we look at their artworks, we can see that we can't go very far into the artwork. It kind of stops. It's almost like it hits a wall. The objects, or in Kunishida's artwork, the people are very close together. It feels kind of cramped, and you can't go very far back into the picture. It feels kind of flat. When an artwork feels flatter, then it would be considered shallow space. So shallow space means that there's not a lot of depth in an artwork. What do you think deep space means? Clearly, it would be the opposite. So deep space means there's a lot of depth in the artwork. And when we look at artworks with deep space, we tend to see objects disappearing far in the distance, or it feels like there's a lot of room to move around. You can maybe frolic in the artwork. So we're going to look at two more artworks by the exact same artists, but this time they're incorporating deep space. So when we see Andy Goldsworthy's art, we see these objects going far in the distance. Same with Kunishida's. The figures have a lot of room to move around as they're having their snowball fight. And we see the landscape going even further back in the distance. So there's a lot of depth taking place in these images. Now, the second type of space that we're going to talk about is no longer about depth per se, but it's about kind of the shape of the areas of space in an artwork. So that would be positive space and negative space. So when we talk about positive space, we're talking about the areas of focus, and those are the important parts of an artwork. So generally the things that the artist wants you to look at first, that would be the positive space. Whereas negative space would be the space around the areas of focus. And that's usually the background of an artwork. So we're going to see a fun example of positive and negative space in graphic design. So you may have seen the FedEx logo before. Some of you may already know what I'm about to say, but when we look at the logo, so the letters themselves would be the positive space. So they're the areas of focus. However, the person who designed this logo did something clever with the negative space. So the way they arranged the letters and kind of put them together to create this logo ended up creating an arrow between the E and the X, as you can see right there. So once you see it, you can't really unsee it, right? So what's clever about that is, arrows tend to imply motion, and FedEx is a shipping company. So when you look at this logo, your brain sees that arrow, whether you know it or not, and it might subconsciously think to itself, oh, they must ship things really fast. I don't know why I think that, but clearly I think that for some reason. And it's because your brain notices that space, that arrow there, and thinks about motion. So you're like, oh. So basically, graphic designers are messing with your brain, and that's pretty wild. All right, we're going to look at an artwork by M.C. Escher, too, to talk about positive and negative space. So Escher was really a master of playing with positive and negative space in what he calls his tessellations. So as we go across the image, whether from right to left or left to right, what originally is the negative space slowly transforms into the positive space of the image. And he does this in a lot of his different artworks, and just to kind of mess with your brains if you like to create a lot of different illusions in his artwork. Another element of art is shape and form. Let's take a look. Shape would be on the left, form is on the right. So what's the difference between the two? Well, shapes are two-dimensional, and forms are three-dimensional. So when we look at a shape, it has two dimensions. It's got height and width, whereas a form has three dimensions. So it has height, width, and depth. That's the primary difference between the two. One is flat, one has volume to it. Now, there are two ways of describing shapes and forms, and that would be the terms geometric and organic. So when we think about geometric lines, shapes, and forms, we see them as being mathematical, and they often have hard, sharp edges, with the only exception being circles and spheres. So circles and spheres are considered geometric because they don't really exist in nature, or at least perfect circles and perfect spheres don't really exist in nature. There's always some kind of inconsistency in them. So that's why we consider them a geometric shape or form. So when we think about geometric shapes and forms, we think of math. So squares and rectangles and circles and ovals and triangles and stars. Maybe we have hexagons and heptagons and octagons and nonagons. Nonagon's my favorite word. I love it. When we think about geometric forms, perhaps we have a cube or a pyramid or a cone, a sphere. Maybe we want to get crazy and have some polygons or icosahedrons or dodecahedrons. That's also one of my favorite words. Those dangerous dodecahedrons. You got to watch out for them. So geometric involves those math shapes. Anytime you think of something you learned in geometry, geometric. All right, now organic, we're not talking food. When we talk about organic lines, shapes, and forms, we are talking about similar to organic food in that it's natural. So organic lines, shapes, and forms are natural or free form, and they tend to have curvy or soft edges. So let's look at a few examples. A lot of times when we look at or try to describe organic shapes or forms, we don't really have words for them. They're usually just blobby shapes or blobby forms or, weird. I don't have words for whatever that is. It's a thing that is very natural. So when we talk about organic things, we don't usually have names for them. Now let's talk about our last element of art for today, and that is texture. So what is texture? It's how something feels or appears to feel. Now, there are two categories of texture. And so when I talk about categories, I'm not saying like adjectives for describing how something feels, but just different types that we would describe. And the first is actual texture. And that's texture you can actually feel. So, for example, if I were to touch my shirt, it feels soft, right? Or if I were to run my hand across the sand on the beach, it's going to feel kind of gritty. Or maybe I'm playing with slime, and it's going to feel squishy and slimy. So that's how things actually feel. Now, a lot of times in two-dimensional art especially, we have something called visual texture. And that is texture you can see, but you can't feel. We also call this implied texture. So we're implying that it feels like something, but it doesn't actually feel that way. So I'm going to give you a pop quiz. This is an artwork by Damien Hirst. It is a diamond-studded human skull. Quite a bit morbid, also quite a bit expensive. Now, is this skull visual or actual texture? It's actually a trick question. It's visual texture because we can see the sharp, ugly, and hard texture of those diamonds. But if we tried to touch it, we'd actually just feel the smoothness of the screen in front of us. Oh, I got you. But if you were actually in the gallery where it is displayed, you could actually feel it, but you'd probably get escorted out in handcuffs if you did. So, moral of the story, it's visual texture. You can see it, but you can't feel it. So that's all I have for you for...
Okay, I just wanted to show you guys her video because I have this similar slideshow with the elements of art, but I really like the examples that she has, especially the more modern art. So that's why we ran through that one. Again, though, if you want to rewatch it, it's the video link that says Understanding the Elements of Art. And it's up on your Google Classroom. Now, this is my slideshow, and I have a video up of me reading through it. Also, I'm not going to read all this back to you because it's basically what we just covered. For me, I listed as 7 elements of art. When she went through them, she only listed 6 because she combined shape and form because it's a 2D and a 3D version of the same thing. But I keep them separate, so you might see that number vary from teacher to teacher, depending on how they group shape and form. But here's the list: line, shape, color, value, texture, form, and space. We will cover all of those, with this being sort of the intro level of art in high school. We'll cover all of those through different projects. And I start with lawn because, in my opinion, lawn is the most important one because it kind of touches into all the other elements of art. Really quickly, I'm going to recap on some of the stuff she talked about with lines just because that's what you need to know for this week's project and next week's project. And I'm thinking the week after that still has to do with lines. She defined line, and I always say that it's a path through space created by a dot. So if you drop your pen on a piece of paper and drag that dot along, you make a line, whether it's straight, curvy, bouncy, diagonal, horizontal. All those different descriptors can just mean different kinds of lines, but a line's a line. Like, it still exists once you start moving that dot through space. Now, there's some different ways to describe it as far as thinner thickness, and I call that line weight, because if it's a thin little wispy line, it doesn't have a lot of weight to it. Whereas if you use one of those huge, like, Magnum Sharpies that you write yard sale posters with, that's like an inch wide, you're going to get a much heavier weight line. So this one almost looks like a mascara brush to me because it's such a thick line of just solid black. But if you were drawing eyelashes, you wouldn't want that giant Sharpie line. You would want a thin, lightweight line. Okay, the other thing is line quality, where some of our artwork, so I'm going to talk to you about trying to do contours, smooth lines that outline everything. When you get done, it looks like a nice, clean drawing. So this one right here looks a little cleaner because it's done with a contour line. Now down here at the bottom, this is a rough sketch. So it looks really, really sketchy, and there's a lot of little jagged lines. But in the end, you can definitely see space, texture, value. Like, it adds the other elements of art in there. Okay, so then she mentioned value as one of the other elements. We're going to talk about it just because I want you to know, if you put your lines close together on this line landscape, you're going to get one of the darker end of the value scale. Now, if your lines are spaced apart really far, like the top of it, you're going to get a lighter color overall. Okay, and the other thing that I like to mention, and you don't have to know this until we get a little further in pencil drawing, but the closer an object is, the clearer it's going to look. So if you look out your window and look really far away at a tree, it's going to be kind of blurrier. It's probably going to look lighter, like kind of foggy-ish because of that blur. And you're not going to be able to see every limb. Whereas if you look out your window and there's a tree right next to your house or to your bedroom, then that tree is going to be a little bit darker. You're going to see more of the details, and it would be clearer, less fuzzy. So, go ahead. Any questions so far? I have one more thing to talk about lines before I talk about the actual project. Okay, so she talked about actual and implied, or actual and visual. So the thing about line being in every other element is, even though it may not be there, like this first one, you can see this backwards S. Now these other three examples are not actually a line, but they make your eye follow a line. So if you look at this, your eye kind of traces along and makes this and follows that pathway, which is a line. Same thing here, because the way they stopped the pattern at a certain point all the way up and down, your eye is seeing another line. And then just in this last one, the boundary between two solid shapes creates a line. Even though there's not an actual trace line there, you still see one. Okay, so that's me recapping on lines. Now I want to go out to the dot cam. I have to turn it back on. It turned itself off. I was talking too long. So your project for this week is a line landscape. Has anyone started this? You guys are in my class that had more time since we didn't meet yesterday. Silence. Okay, well, if anybody has started it, hopefully you read through the directions. If not, I can give you some pointers. But I'll go through kind of how to start this and then work it till the end. So you do not have to choose a mountain and sun landscape. Let me get up to I have a bazillion tabs open. So in your assignment, you do not have to choose just a mountain and sun landscape. There were a few other examples in there. I think there was one with waves. You can find this under classwork and then projects. The internet's really slow when all the teachers are at the school going through lives. So underneath this, you can find some examples and you can find the videos. But if you just type in line landscapes in a search bar, you're also going to get a lot of examples. Again, you have to watch the little spiral for a second. So this does not have to be a black and white project only. If you want to use some of your markers, you sure can. The next project we're doing is going to be black and white only. So if you want to use color for this one, feel free. I'm going to come back over to my dot cam though. So the way I started was I wanted to make mountains and I didn't want them to be perfect. Like I didn't want them to be perfect bumps that looked like they were going to create a scale pattern.
It kind of looks like scales.
It does. So if you do perfect hills, but then at the same time, if you do perfect mountains, it looks a little more cartoony. So if you're going for a more realistic look, I would say start on one edge of the paper and try to get to the other, but hold the end of your drawing device. I'm using a pen right now. And then drag it and then kind of let it go back and forth and make it jagged. Okay, that way you don't get the perfect effect. Sometimes if you're drawing something like a landscape, you don't want it to look like cookie cutter, like exactly the same as anybody else could have drawn. You want it to be something that only your hand made. Now, again, there's always times when you want your stuff to have that perfect cartoon, simplified version, like logos, t-shirt designs. Sometimes you want it to have that effect. But for this, we're trying to give it a little bit of realism. So then someone asked yesterday about dividing the mountains in half. You can do it either way. I wanted to do it to where mine had a light side of the mountain and a dark side of the mountain. Probably from watching Bob Ross paintings, because a lot of times he does the light and shadow. So I told him I started with like the idea of an S or like a river and divided it that way to where it's kind of curvy. And then maybe this one just goes off the page. Okay, so there's some mountains divided up. And then I always like to include the sun. Somebody's calling. Hang on a second. You don't have to include the sun. You could do clouds. You could do trees. You could do any number of things on there. But okay, then you're going to fill it with line patterns. I tried to use a big variety of them. If you look at the examples, some of these have, like they use the same lines again and again, like just a curvy line, thin, close together, far apart, thin, thick. Some of them like this use different patterns. A lot of this project is choice, and there's a ton of different ways to do it. There's not really a wrong way of doing it. As long as you have lines and you make it a landscape somehow. Now, even that is flexible. If you come up with another way of doing a line project, let me know so that I'm not expecting the line landscape from you. Somebody else has already sent me another idea that was the same idea, but a little different. Okay, so then you come back in and start filling it in. So if you want to do the curvy lines, I told them yesterday, well, you can't see my hand, so it's not helping y'all at all. So I told them like to start filling this in. If you're doing curvy lines, or you want to do like the lines that look like they cup around each other each time, like they're curved but they fan out. I keep my wrist on the table so that it doesn't move a lot, and I just swing my pencil back and forth. So if you do this, it'll help them stay a little bit more parallel. If that's something you're worried about. Like if you're worried about shaking too much because your hand's up in the air, like brace your arm against the table that you're using. Okay, so there's no set way that you have to make your lines. Okay, so let me finish off this little section and then I'll go into my straight line area and then I'll take questions. Okay, so there's my curved lines on this one. Then for straight lines, like if you want them to be totally straight, I have told a lot of people that like junk mail is really good for making a straight line. Like I have this command strip package on my desk that I've been using. You can see the Sharpie marks on it. But if you want them to be perfectly straight, just find something that you can hold down the edge of your paper. The thing about making something into a straight edge, like a ruler, is that you just have to hold it still when you're pressing against it. So like my thumb is holding it against the paper down there. And then occasionally it doesn't hurt to pick it up and make sure, like I didn't want to make a line up there in that negative space. Okay. So any other questions? This was one that people asked about yesterday, about how I make it look like it's almost like bubbled or 3D.
This is getting boring.
Thanks, Jackson. That's just done by like cupping that Sharpie to where the C's connect. Any of these you can practice on your own time too. Okay. Did anybody come into the meeting late? Because I have more than I thought I had. So if you came in late, message me. But other than that, does anybody else have questions about making your line landscape?
I don't.
Okay. That's all I have for today. So if you want to stay on and ask any individual questions, you can. Otherwise, you're good. I think I've got everybody on attendance.
Okay.
Bye, Jackson. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye, Heather. Bye, Hayden.
So, about the mountain thing. So, yeah, never mind. I just answered my own question. Sorry.
Cheyenne, I think I got you. I saw your name pop up. I'm trying to make sure I actually take y'all's attendance and help y'all out on the IC thing today. Yeah, I've got you done there, Cheyenne. So you're good. Did Haley? Wesley, I think it's just me and you now. You good? Hey, who called Miss Pittman?
I think it was Miss Stevens. She was just like, she said, okay, I'll call back. And I was like, I was going to say, is this Miss Stevens? And she was like, oh, okay.
I'll call up there and ask her. Wesley, you still there? Do you have any questions, bud? He just hung up without saying anything, like, oh. Yeah. Oh, goodness. But see, okay, so that was 35 minutes. That was with me. Hang on, let me finish recording this video. I forgot.